Hello, and welcome to our second lecture in our Introduction to Philosophy course. Today we're going to be talking about how to evaluate arguments. That is, how to tell if an argument is good or bad. Now, this might seem like it's going to be a really simple skill to learn, but as we'll learn throughout the semester, we're going to encounter some pretty complex arguments, and quite frankly, even those arguments that we see in our everyday lives have a lot of hidden complexity to them. So let's talk about how we can cut through that complexity to understand whether or not an argument is good. The first thing to become clear on is, what does it mean to be a good argument? Well, a good argument isn't just one that seems believable or has a conclusion that you agree with or sounds right. A good argument is going to be one in which the premises, and the premises alone, are independently sufficient to demonstrate the plausibility of the conclusion, right? So remember, an argument is a series of statements, these premises, that are intended to demonstrate the plausibility of the conclusion, this final statement, this conclusion. To be a good argument means that it is successful in that task, that those premises demonstrate the plausibility of the conclusion. The way I'm saying this, I know, might sound a little forced and technical. The reason here, though, is that we need to stress the importance of that connection between the premises and the conclusions to exclude cases where the conclusion may be plausible for reasons entirely unrelated to the premises. It's in fact possible for a conclusion of an argument to be plausible even while the premises are false or totally unrelated to the conclusion. Take, for instance, our bad argument A, a false premise with a plausible conclusion. The moon is made of green cheese premise. Incredibly implausible, right? Almost certainly false. Unless the world is very, very different than we thought it was. Conclusion, the Earth is not the center of the solar system. Incredibly plausible, almost certainly true. So we got an argument with a very plausible conclusion, right? But the premise is extremely implausible. And since the premise, being so implausible, doesn't have any epistemic weight, that is, it doesn't have any value as a piece of evidence, it can't be what makes that conclusion plausible. Now, this is a ridiculous instance, but these sorts of things do happen, right? People will make an argument, and they'll use the fact that the apparent conclusion of this argument is a plausible conclusion as evidence for the premise, and that's just backwards. So don't do that. Another bad argument B, is one with an irrelevant premise with a plausible conclusion. So something like, trees require sunlight to grow, the Earth is not the center of the solar system. Well, again, both of these actually are very plausible. In fact, they almost both seem certainly true, but they're entirely unrelated. So they don't really have the kind of evidential connection that we look for between a premise and its conclusions. So let's talk about some more realistic bad arguments in this sense. So we could talk about something like, everyone agrees that murder is wrong, therefore it is wrong. Now, this may not actually be a bad argument. It depends on what one thinks about the origin of morality. This is a question we'll talk about later. But let's say we don't buy the idea that what everybody thinks determines the truth of the moral fact. If we don't buy that, then that premise is actually irrelevant to the argument being made. And in fact, it's a form of fallacy. Type of common bad argument. And we're going to spend most of the rest of today, most of the rest of this lecture, talking about fallacies and getting a few tools under our belt that will help us rapidly diagnose these sorts of faulty arguments. But before we go any further, the thing I want to hammer in here is that the reason this is a bad argument is because, since the premise is unrelated to the conclusion, that is, the popularity of a view of morality to the truth of moral statements, that the premise cannot be the reason that we find that conclusion to be plausible. Right? A common counterexample would be something like, well, for most of history, most people thought slavery was okay. We probably don't want to say that was okay then. But that's something we'll talk about more once we get to ethics. Let's talk about the fallacies then. So fallacies are common kinds of bad arguments. Now, these are not going to always be wrong, but they are usually wrong. And we're going to go through three different kinds of fallacies. The first, the appeal fallacies, rely upon appeal to irrelevant facts. That is, they use an irrelevant set of facts as evidence for a conclusion that's just not related. So essentially, they're kind of like argument B. That is, they use potentially true but unrelated premises to justify something that really isn't connected to it in any way. There are the oppositional fallacies, which misrepresent opposing views. These are sort of special in that oppositional fallacies only occur in context of arguing with someone. Like arguing against someone, not just forming a formal argument, an actual debate. And finally, we've got these structural fallacies. Structural fallacies misrepresent the logic of the discussion itself. That is, they have a sort of backwards view of how the concepts involved relate to one another, or what the logical space is. And we'll get a better picture of that as we get there. This is going to be, that's probably the most nebulous definition of the three categories. But let's take a look at our appeal fallacies, and this is going to help us get a better picture of what bad arguments look like. So, appeal fallacies. They rely upon appeal to irrelevant evidence, that is, they use irrelevant statements as premises, that is, statements that are relevant to the conclusion. They are sometimes acceptable, that is, they're sometimes not actually fallacies, even though they look like it, but that's only the case when you can demonstrate the relevance of the premise that is questionable to the conclusion. All of them are going to be named the appeal to fallacy, the appeal to something. I'm just going to leave that part off the name, so just add appeal to X when you see the names. So our first appeal fallacy is the appeal to compromise. The appeal to compromise is the assumption that a compromise between alternative views is always the best. One example here, some people believe that autism is caused by vaccines, while others believe that they don't, right? That they aren't caused by vaccines. Sorry for the bad grammar on my slides. Therefore, we should believe that some autism is caused by vaccines, right? We see how that's a compromise. It's between the two views here. And for that reason, it might seem plausible, right? The idea that extremes are less plausible than middle values. However, just because something happens to be in the middle doesn't make it more likely to be right than either extreme, right? So if one person says 2 plus 2 equals 4, and another says 2 plus 2 equals 22, we don't go to 13 to meet in the middle. We say, no, sorry, Mr. 22, you're wrong, it's 4. Likewise, I mean, one of my favorite sort of joke examples here is if I ever said, hey, let's all drive on the right side of the road, and someone says, let's all drive on the left. And then we say, oh, what the heck, we'll drive right down the middle. Everybody's going to die in a horrible, fiery car accident. So maybe not do that. So just because something is a compromise doesn't mean it's best. However, there is a value to compromise. And the appeal to compromise is making an appropriate appeal when we're talking about things like, potentially, values in a democratic society, right, or plans amongst a democratic group, right? We're coming together, we're making our opinions and saying, well, I'd like to do this and I'd like to do this. We say, well, how about we meet in the middle and do this, right? Compromises can be made in a way that satisfies almost everyone or is at least more satisfactory to everyone than the opposite possibilities, right? They're the views they oppose. So we shouldn't assume that all compromise is bad either. And there are cases in which compromise is built into the system. Another case, for instance, is what's called the wisdom of crowds. If you take a whole bunch of people together and say put one of those jars with jelly beans in it and say, hey, guess how many jelly beans there are? And you average everybody's answer together, you're probably going to come up with an answer that's very, very close to the true one. This is a phenomenon called the wisdom of crowds in social psychology. And what this demonstrates essentially is by compromising between all these views, you end up with a more accurate view than almost any one of them. So compromise is sometimes relevant, but often it is a misleading red herring. It isn't really all that relevant to our arguments. Our next fallacy is the appeal to authority. An appeal to authority fallacies appeal to the agreement of an important person or institution, an authority, on a subject matter to demonstrate or to try to demonstrate the plausibility of a conclusion. So we might say, Stephen Hawking says that philosophy is dead, so we shouldn't study it. Well, obviously I'm going to disagree with that, but let's set that aside for a minute, right? So Stephen Hawking is a very smart man. He's a physicist, for those of you who aren't familiar with him. A very, very smart man, but he is not a philosopher, right? The problem with the appeal to authority fallacy occurs mostly when we use a wrong authority, right? So arguably Stephen Hawking is not an appropriate authority here because, well, we don't know if he has any philosophical authority. He's certainly an authority in physics, right? If he tells me something about physics, I'm probably going to buy it. But if he tells me something about philosophy, economics, there's no real reason for me to believe that he has any better understanding of this than I do. Sometimes it is appropriate to appeal to authorities. For instance, like I just said, if Stephen Hawking talks to me about black holes, after I go, holy crap, Stephen Hawking is talking to me, after I have that reaction, I'm probably just going to buy whatever he says, because Stephen Hawking knows way more than I do. It's important to note, however, that it's not just because Dr. Hawking is an authority. It's because I am trusting that Dr. Hawking is familiar with the relevant arguments to be made and is more capable of analyzing them than I am. The same thing happens when I take my doctor's advice, right? I'm saying, well, you just know more about bodies and medicine than I do, and health than I do. So I'm going to do pretty much whatever you tell me because this is your field, right? You know better than me here. Of course, we wouldn't take, say, our medical doctor's opinion on climate change all that seriously because while they're very well educated, they're not an authority here. Cases when authority is appropriate again, right? That's going to be, one is when it's a legitimate authority relevant to the fact you're claiming. And in those cases, where you're using the appeal to authority for is something like a truncation or an abbreviation of, there's an argument out there. This person says that there's an argument out there. They're generally reliable. They're well informed in the field. They're better equipped to analyze it than I am. So I'm going to have to trust them. And since there's too much for us to know, that just has to be okay sometimes. Another interesting case where the appeal to authority is appropriate is when you have an authority figure who actually gets to determine the facts. So one case where this might be relevant is something like the Pope. Under certain conditions, the Pope can make binding moral law. Right? They can make a decree, and it is now law on heaven and earth, at least according to Catholic beliefs, right? In that case, the Pope said so may in fact determine the facts in the world. So this is an interesting case. It's kind of like a king making a dictum about law, right? If the king says, it is now illegal to hunt in that forest, right? Well, it's now illegal to hunt in that forest. If the Supreme Court of the United States says that a certain law is constitutional or unconstitutional, well, that's their job. They get to determine that. And once they've made their ruling, they've made their ruling. Appealing to that authority after that point, well, that's what it means now. That's just what it means. There are people who disagree with that, and depending upon your view of constitutional interpretation, but we'll set that aside. Our next appeal fallacy is the appeal to popularity. We appeal to the claim that something is popular or a belief is popular. Man, I have a lot of bad grammar on these slides. Please forgive me. And we're going to use that popularity to indicate the truth or validity of the idea that we're putting forward. So something like, lots of people believe in astrology, so there must be something to it, right? There must be something to this idea. Everyone believes in it. Well, as the saying goes, if all your friends were jumping off the bridge, would you follow? Of course not, right? Popularity is not often a reliable indicator of truth. And in fact, there's a relatively famous quote, which is, what is popular is not often right, and what is right is not often popular. And we can look back historically and see that values we believe are horrific were popular once upon a time, right? So popularity is generally not a reliable metric. There are cases, however, when we're going to trust it. So one time will be for something like a democratic society. In a democratic society, appeal to popularity is essentially how we make laws, right? We say, hey, this was the most popular view. Most people said this is what we should do, so this is what we should do. That's how our system works. Another case when the appeal to popularity might work is when we cross it with the appeal to authority. And we have popularity amongst authorities. So let's talk about climate change, for instance. Well, there are some individual scientists who are doubtful about whether or not climate change is influenced by human factors. And in fact, some of these are in fact climatologists, the kinds of scientists we would consider to be authorities. However, if we look amongst that population, we see that the far more popular view, about 97%, is that human factors significantly contribute to climate change. In this case, we have popularity amongst the authority. Right? The reason that popularity alone isn't usually enough to give us anything is because we have no reason to believe that the populace being surveyed has any particular special epistemic status. That is, that they know any better than we do. That is, we have no reason to believe that the populace as a whole is knowledgeable. But when we refine ourselves, right, when we restrict ourselves, rather, to a populace that is knowledgeable, that is, a populace that we have reason to believe has true beliefs, or plausible beliefs at least, about the way the world works in this particular question, right, in virtue of this particular question, they have expert knowledge, then the appeal to popularity is more reliable. This also works for sort of common sense claims. So things like, is this a mug? Well, it's actually a little travel mug thermos thing. Key. Anyway, right? Sit down and ask people, hey, is there an object in my hand? Well, yeah. Am I holding up two fingers? Yes. Right. We can rely on popularity here because, essentially, most people are considered to be epistemic experts in this way. That is, everybody is assumed to have mostly reliable, mostly true beliefs in these regards. So that's another case in which we can trust popularity. Let's move on now. So our next appeal fallacy is the appeal to doubt. The appeal to doubt fallacy occurs when someone appeals to the fact that something is hard to understand, or that they don't understand it, or that relative alternatives are complex or hard to understand or hard to propose, to argue that that view must be false or that plan must be untrustworthy. For example, human contribution to global warming doesn't make sense to me, so it must not be true. Now, this is obviously a bad argument, because just because it doesn't make sense to you or to me doesn't mean it doesn't make sense. The physics around high energy physics, right? Subatomic particles and all this stuff, I don't really have a background in it that's strong enough to understand a lot of the research that's coming out now. In fact, if I open most research journals in the world about anything, almost anything but philosophy and maybe psychology, I would probably encounter some stuff that confused me. And in fact, the same is probably true for you, right? We regularly encounter things that we just don't understand. Our personal doubt is not sufficient to demonstrate that something is implausible. Unless we are epistemic experts. Again, this phrase I keep using. Epistemic meaning related to knowledge, right? They have some sort of special understanding about the subject matter. If I look at a mathematical proof and say, well, I don't see how that works, that's probably not a very strong condemnation. My math skills are all right, but they're not that great. If a mathematician looks at it and says, I do not see what you're saying here, this doesn't make sense to me, that might be time to reconsider whether or not you're actually saying anything meaningful. Right? So when it's the doubt of someone who should be able to understand it were it to be a reasonable statement, then we are going to fall back to saying, okay, well, maybe the appeal to doubt here is appropriate, right? So if all the physicists gather around, they look at your paper that you've written for a physics journal, and they go, this just does not make any sense whatsoever. Well, their doubt is legitimate evidence, because their doubt demonstrates that even someone who is an epistemic expert finds this view incomprehensible or innately implausible. While this isn't, of course, a knockdown evidence of its falsehood, it does demonstrate that we should probably rationally not believe in it, right? It is arguably not plausible, and most importantly, since we have to reference these experts to get around in our everyday life, we're just going to have to say, well, that guy doubts you, and that guy knows a lot about this stuff, and so do all those other guys who know a lot about this stuff, so I'm going to have to kind of trust them here more than I trust you, because you're an individual and you don't have any further sort of confirmation. Again, like most of these things, this is not going to be an easy cut and dry rule. These are all guidelines. And we're going to find cases that are going to be unsatisfactory, right? We're going to find cases where, yeah, actually this person's doubt does matter because they really are the smartest person alive, right? And they really do understand the material. And we're also going to find cases where the doubt of a bunch of smart people is just wrong. And that just has to be the case it is, right? We need to focus, though, on adopting the most rational beliefs we can, right? Plausibility is about reasonable belief that something is true. And so if the experts in the field doubt something, it is reasonable to believe that it is not true. Our next fallacy is the appeal to emotion fallacy. This fallacy occurs when when someone's appealing to the fact that they have strong feelings or strong emotions regarding some position or fact or state of the world or program or goal, that they have some sort of privileged knowledge. That is, because I feel strongly, I know strongly, right? That is the key line here. For instance, I really do care about improving education. But if I were to infer from this that I know how to pursue it best, how to best improve our education more than anybody else because I care so deeply, well, that would just be wrong. Or that even someone who doesn't care at all might know more than me, right? That's the case. They could. They really could, even if they don't care. There are a couple of reasons, though, that emotion can be appropriate. One of the most obvious cases is if we are talking about emotion, whether we're talking about individual emotions, right? I feel such and such. Of course, my feelings are relevant to how I feel. Also, things like psychological discussions of emotions. Those are going to be relevant again. We can also take the presence of strong emotion to be an indicator of investment. And while this is a very rough guideline, usually people who care a lot about something spend time learning about it. At the same time, we have to be careful how much we trust that, because there is a tendency of people who care a lot about something but don't have formal education in it to end up being pulled into essentially conspiracy theories, that is, or pseudosciences. Well, they're going to be misled about what people in the field believe and what's actually plausible given the evidence we have, because they're getting a very piecemeal introduction to the material, and they're not given the full background that we would need to be able to understand appropriately what is going on here. Our final fallacy, I think final? Actually, probably not our final. We have two more. I'm sorry. Our next fallacy, however, is the appeal to nature fallacy. The appeal to nature appeals to the claim that something is natural, to use this as evidence for the claim that it is either good or inevitable. Or not natural and bad. So, for instance, genetically modified crops are not natural, so we can't trust them to be healthy. Likewise, things like marijuana is natural, so it can't be dangerous. Now, we might have concerns about both of these things, right? We might believe both of these conclusions, but the premises given are very weak, right? There are lots of things that aren't natural that are perfectly safe, right? Let's talk about books. Books aren't natural, but they're wonderful. Clothing is not natural, but it is pretty safe and healthy, and I would recommend wearing clothes, right? Heating and air conditioning is not natural, but it's probably good for you. Just because something is not natural doesn't make it unhealthy. Medicine is an obvious case here. On the other hand, just because something is natural doesn't mean it's healthy for you. Bears are natural, but I don't recommend going out into the wood and, trying to smoke a bear. Probably wouldn't turn out well for you. Atropa belladonna, better known as deadly nightshade, is also natural, but if you take even a slight amount of it, it could kill you. Right? There are lots of things in this world that would be totally happy to kill you. Nature here can also mean a more restricted sense, that is, like human nature. One common appeal to nature fallacy you'll hear are things like men aren't naturally designed to be monogamous, right? That is, men are not naturally designed to have a single partner. They're meant to have multiple partners. So we shouldn't expect them to be able to be like good husbands, right? Or to be able to be honest and faithful. Well, that's just wrong. First of all, we're not designed to wear clothes, but yet here I am, fully clothed. There's a lot of things in our life that are purely social conventions. Things like checkbooks, right? That have no naturalness to them, right? They're totally artificial systems. And yet we're able to keep up with them pretty well. So there's no real indication in this case that it's going to be the case that men can't be or shouldn't be held responsible for their actions in this way. Even if it were the case that men weren't designed to be monogamous, I'll leave that question up to evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists. Of course, nature is relevant when we're discussing nature, and there is a limited sense in which it can be relevant regarding things like morality. if it's impossible for something to act a certain way, that is, if it's totally against my nature, not in the sense of I'm not prone to doing it, I'm not likely to do it, but more in the sense of I literally cannot do this, then we might have an argument here. This is based off of an idea of a principle called ought implies can. To say that I ought to do something implies that I am able to do it. One case we might look at in the modern world is something like, all people ought not to have any prejudice whatsoever. Well, that's a beautiful sentiment, and it would be very nice if that were the case. But given the evidence we have about human psychology, it may actually not be possible to eliminate prejudice. In fact, you can create prejudices that have never existed in minutes by just dividing people up by arbitrary features. They've done experiments where they divided school students up by eye color, and within the day, mythologies had arisen, and people were talking about how, well, those blue eyes. Right. And we see how this is done over and over again. Think about stereotypes about hair color. I mean, forget the big ones, right? Forget race, forget ethnicity, forget culture. Talk about hair color. Talk about the kind of clothes people wear. Talk about the kind of cars they drive. And we have opinions about people based upon these things. We might take this to be evidence that it's not possible for human beings to not be prejudiced against one another. This is a little bit depressing, honestly. But this doesn't stop us from saying something like, we ought not let our prejudices cause us to treat people poorly or influence the way we treat people. Because just because we can't stop from having them doesn't mean we can't stop from employing them or using them or letting them govern us. But that's a relatively rare case. In general, the appeal to nature is a relatively weak argument. But there are cases, like we mentioned, like when we're talking about nature, and then when we're talking about things like, for instance, whether or not it's possible for a human, right, given human nature, to act in a certain way. Oh, that was our last one. I thought we had an extra one. Well then, let's move on to our oppositional fallacies. This program's... I'm still learning. We'll get through this together. Okay, it wasn't our last one. I thought so. The appeal to origin fallacy. I think I got the slides jumbled up there. I'm sorry, I don't want to restart just for that. So, the appeal to origin fallacy occurs when we claim that an idea shares properties with the person, institution, or group that originated it. That is, just because somebody acted a certain way or came up with a certain idea, we can know that this idea is like them in some way. So let's talk about Isaac Newton, right? Physicist, gravity, that guy. Well, Newton was really smart, and Newton was also obsessed with alchemy. That is the magical pseudoscience of transmuting matter into other forms, right? Turning lead into gold, all that. So we might say, well, Newton, really smart guy, really into alchemy, so alchemy must be a really smart subject. It must be something worth studying. That is clearly wrong. We also see things like, well, Stalin, presumably a bad guy, right? He did lots of terrible things, was a socialist. So socialism must be bad and violent, like Stalin. Probably the most common person that gets brought up in these discussions is Hitler, obviously. Right? You go 3 steps deep in any argument online, and Hitler is right there all of a sudden. Right? Because Hitler once did this, so anyone who does this must be Hitler. Right? Unless you're talking about the systematic extermination of entire peoples, that's not really what we think of Hitler as having done. Right? Hitler was also a landscape artist. That doesn't mean that all landscape artists are genocidal maniacs. So those are our appeal fallacies. And our appeal fallacies, right, they're all bound together by this irrelevant evidence being used to support a conclusion that just isn't really related. By the way, the case in which an appeal to origin fallacy is appropriate is going to be something like when the idea is the very thing for which we attribute that property to the person. So if we said something like, Hitler exterminated millions of innocent people, And we wanted to say, well, therefore exterminating millions of innocent people is wrong. Well, that's a weird argument for getting there, but the reason we think of Hitler as being a bad guy is because he did that. So, yeah, fair enough. So those are our Peel fallacies. Let's move on. The next category is our oppositional fallacies. Oppositional fallacies occur when we mischaracterize the view of an opponent or we change the topic of a debate all of a sudden. Unlike an appeal fallacy, which can really occur anywhere, even in your own thoughts, oppositional fallacies require someone to argue against. That is, they require another view to really be brought out. The first of these, and one of the most common, is the burden of proof. And this occurs when we require someone disprove a position without providing any reason to believe that it's plausible. So generally speaking, the burden of proof in an argument falls on the person making a positive claim. That is, the person saying that something is true. They're the ones who have to prove themselves. We make the burden of proof fallacy when we say, well, you can't prove I'm wrong, so I must be right. For instance, we cannot prove that psychic powers are not real, so we should accept that there are psychics out there. Right? Or we can't prove that ghosts aren't real, so we have to believe that they are. Or more commonly, for instance, you can't prove that God doesn't exist, so you must accept that he does. You can't prove that the universe wasn't created 5 minutes ago in this exact state. Or 5 seconds ago in this exact state, rather. And so we have to accept that. The problem with these is that they've gotten the argumentative burden wrong. That is, they've gotten it wrong about who needs to prove themselves here. If someone is just saying, I don't know, they don't really need a burden of proof there, generally speaking. The person who has the burden of proof, the person who needs to prove themselves, is the person who's saying that something is true or something is the case. The person who's saying that psychic powers are real should be able to demonstrate psychic powers or bring a psychic with them. Let us test it. Right? The one case where the burden of proof fallacy is actually an okay thing to do is what we might call properly basic ideas or very, very obvious ones. So things like, this is a hand, here it is. If someone says, I don't know if that's a hand. Okay. I guess. Right? It's a very weird thing to say. Now, we are going to run into some people, by the way, when we talk about knowledge, who have views like this, and actually the example I just gave is a response to them. But in general, the burden of proof lies upon whoever is making their argument. Next up is perfectionism. Perfectionism occurs when we reject any plan or account of something because it contains any flaw whatsoever. So take, for example, this argument against drug laws. Right? People still use illegal drugs, so we should just make them all legal. Well, people still murder people too, but we don't want to go making that legal. And of course, any tax system that we propose is going to have some people essentially cheating the system. But that doesn't mean we should just not have one, right? We just need to find the best one. And this is why perfectionism is a fallacy. We're not looking for perfect opportunities. We're not looking for a perfect world or a perfect plan or a perfect theory. We're looking for the best possible plan and the best possible theory. And that may include some imperfections. We might just not be able to know certain things. We might just not be able to control certain things, and we need to accept that as we work. Of course, there are times when the flaws are so big that pointing them out is appropriate, right? Well, I see what you're saying here, but everyone's gonna die if we do that, so we probably shouldn't, right? That's not quite perfectionism. That's not quite a fallacy. We're saying here that the flaw is so big that it essentially limits the effectiveness of the plan to fulfill its purpose. Right. That said, generally speaking, merely saying that something has a flaw without proposing a plan that has better properties, that is, without presenting a plan that is better, is not an adequate rebuttal of a plan or an idea. Next up, we have the fallacy. I've included this one because in the past I've had students get really cocky with their fallacies and feeling like, oh yeah, I can shoot down everybody because I can point out the fallacies. Just because an argument has a fallacy in it doesn't mean it's wrong. Doesn't mean the conclusion is false, nor does it mean the argument is entirely a bad argument. Just like you can have sort of part of something break, right? So part of a banana can be brown while the rest of it's fine, right? Or part of an apple can be bruised while the rest of it's fine. You just need to cut off that little bit. Part of an argument can be fallacious or otherwise bad while the rest of it is fine. This mostly works for arguments that have multiple chains of argumentation as opposed to just one long chain, because then, if you lose one pillar but you have four more, the building will still stand. Now, if you have one really long pillar and it's cut off halfway through, well then yeah, your argument's kind of screwed. That stinks. Oh well. But just because someone's made a fallacy doesn't mean that the argument is entirely bad. The case, right, again, that is most likely to be okay, an argument that can tolerate a fallacy, is if it's a multi-pillar argument, right? Multiple chains going down, multiple methods of justifying the system. If one of those is bad and the rest are fine, well, you still have four good arguments. One bad one, but four good ones. Seems to be a pretty good way of dealing with it. Of course, right, if there is a fallacy midway in a chain, that does break that individual chain. And if all things rested upon that one chain, then there's a problem. Right, so just because someone makes, say, an appeal to a nature fallacy at one point in their argument for democracy, doesn't mean his argument for democracy is totally wrong or totally bad. And it certainly doesn't mean that democracy itself is wrong or itself is bad. Next up is personal attack. This is also known as ad hominem. This is probably one of the best known fallacies. The personal attack, or ad hominem fallacies, occurs when we judge the plausibility of a conclusion by appealing to the character of the arguer instead of the nature of the idea itself, right? So a mean person is telling us their attitude on, economic theory, right? Their view of economics. Well, they're mean. I'm not going to listen to them. Who cares? Who cares if someone's a jerk? They could be right. A lot of jerks in the world are unfortunately very good at what they do. And in fact, that's kind of how they get away with being jerks a lot. So just because someone is unlikable or untrustworthy or has other traits that you don't like doesn't mean that the argument they're presenting is bad. A good way to test for this in your own mind when you hear an argument is say, would I reject this argument if someone else were making it? Right? Or would I accept this argument if someone else were making it? If your view of the plausibility of the argument is overly influenced by the individual making it, as opposed to the evidence they present, or the assumptions of the argument itself, then you're probably making some degree of a personal attack fallacy. There are, of course, cases when this is relevant, though. Right? There is something untrustworthy about a moralizing sinner, right? Who comes up and tells you how you should be living your life when they can't seem to get it right. You probably don't want to take investment advice from someone who lost all their money on the stock market. Right? Some of these traits indicate essentially that they're not epistemically reliable, as they don't really know what's going on here. And so that can be relevant. But generally speaking, the character of the individual is irrelevant to the character of the argument, unless that argument is based upon the assumption that they themselves are authorities. In which case, attacking that status as an authority is an appropriate move. Finally, we have the straw man fallacy. So back in medieval Europe, when it got time to learn how to fight, grow up and join the army, fight for your king, what have you, they would build these little men out of straw so that you could fire arrows or stab it and, practice jousting, all of these things. And the great thing about a straw man, the reason it was great to practice on, is you can hit it as hard as you want, and it won't hit you back. Straw men, or the straw man fallacy, occurs when we reject a position by presenting a wildly implausible misinterpretation of the position itself. So something like, environmentalists want to destroy all factories, right? Destroy all American industry just to protect some trees. Well, that is not what environmentalism is about. Likewise, saying something like, Republicans want to bomb everyone who disagrees with us. That is not what republicanism is about, right? These are caricatures. These are straw men. The reason that people like to do this in argument is it makes it really easy to beat your opponent. If your opponent is saying something absolutely ridiculous, well, of course your view is more plausible. And there are instances where someone is genuinely saying ridiculous things. I can think of a few cases in the American political system right now that seem to fit in that category. But, generally speaking, most people are mostly rational, and most of what they say is going to be mostly rational. So we should expect that most positions that we encounter, most arguments that we encounter, are not entirely unreasonable. And if we interpret them as such, we are the ones who are failing our duties as philosophers. Right? We are failing to understand them, to extend the principle of charity to them, which we've talked about before. Well, actually, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but some of those notes from week 1, week 2, earlier notes. All right, we failed to try to interpret them in a way that's beneficial or reasonable, and we're essentially just making it easier on ourselves. The nice thing about a straw man, too, from our perspective, if we use it, is it kind of alleviates the pressure to justify yourself, because if they're really obviously wrong, and you're opposed to them, then you don't really have to look at your own values any deeper than that. You just say, well, they're wrong, really wrong, and I'm on the other side, so I must be right. But if their view is actually somewhat reasonable, but you can still disagree, you say, well, I can see how they believe it, then you need to think very deeply about your own. And that puts a burden on us. So people like to use the straw man as a way to sort of avoid seriously thinking about the topic at hand. But it's a very dangerous mistake to make. And it will ultimately lead to a terrible misunderstanding about what's being said and entirely take an argument off the tracks. So those are our oppositional fallacies. Let's talk about our structural fallacies now. Structural fallacies, this is the vaguest category of fallacy we're going to approach. And the only thing they share is that they utilize sort of faulty logic or faulty logical structures in the making of their argument. They're not a great category, but I just couldn't think of any better name for it. I'm always working to revise this, so if you've got anything, let me know. Anyway, our first structural fallacy is circular reasoning. A circular reasoning fallacy occurs when an argument for S assumes that S is true. So let's say I told you that everything I say is true. And you can trust me, because nothing I say is false. Right? That conclusion, you can trust me because nothing I say is false, well, that's just the premise. That's just a circle, right? So this is why circular reasoning. Now, more sophisticated circles go through multiple steps. But the thing they share is that at its bedrock, that its final assumptions, right? And when you go as far back as you can in the argument, the conclusion itself is in those assumptions. That is, the very argument that is supposed to demonstrate the plausibility of the conclusion assumes the plausibility of the conclusion. It's kind of like trying to pull yourself up by your ankle, right? You're just going to roll over, right? You can't actually get up that way. Likewise, you can't actually build an argument for a conclusion on itself. The only place that circular reasoning is going to be okay is when you're looking at entire conceptual systems, which should be coherent and consistent, and at a certain level will seem circular. But that's a really abstract view, mostly occurs for formal systems like logic, and isn't something we need to worry about very often. If you see circular reasoning, it's almost certainly wrong. Our next structural fallacy is the black or white fallacy. And this occurs when an argument presupposes that there are more limited number of possibilities than there actually are. Basically, at its most simple level, it's saying, well, there's only two possibilities. You're either with us or you're against us. What about neutral? Right, so George Bush is famous for having said this when we began the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not sure which one. Either way. And I'm pretty sure Switzerland would have been surprised to hear that, considering they've been neither with nor against anybody for 150 years now. They've been what's called neutral. That's an option. Likewise, you're pro-choice or pro-life. You're liberal or conservative. Right? These things assume that there are only two values. Now, one of the most common cases where we see the black or white fallacy in a problematic setting is things like this where there's actually a spectrum of views, right? You can be a little bit with someone, or very with someone, right? You can be a little bit liberal, or very conservative, a little conservative, very liberal. You can be moderate, or you can be all over these spectrums. There's also cases when there just are more options, right? There's 3 values, or 4, or 5. The black or white fallacy, it doesn't just have to be 2 values, by the way, so you could limit it to 3 values, right? Conservative, liberal, or moderate. Again, there's intermediate systems, intermediate values. Now, there are some things where there genuinely are a limited number of possible outcomes, right? True or false, at least according to classical Western logic, and classical logic elsewhere as well. Well, yeah, it's either true or false. That's the case. Sorry. Left hand or right hand? Right, my left hand or my right hand. Maybe others have intermediate values, but I only have the 2. So it's going to be one of the 2 if it's in my hand, right? But generally speaking, it is dangerous to assume that there's only a certain number of possible outcomes. The place you see this used most often, by the way, is people say, well, it's either A or B, and it's not B, so it must be A. Right? You should either be liberal or conservative, and you shouldn't be conservative, so you must be the case that you should be very liberal, right? And this is based off an actual effective logical maneuver, but the only works if they are in fact correct about how many values there are. Because if there's a third value, say moderate, and you say, well, you shouldn't be very liberal, so you must have to be very conservative. You say, well, what about moderate? Right? Or if someone points out, well, you should be moderate, you say, well, then you must be very liberal. So, well, what about conservative? Right? So in general, we need to be cautious to make sure we don't mischaracterize the number of possible values, the number of possible conclusions we could come to when we try to answer a certain question. Finally, there's equivocation. Equivocation occurs when an argument uses 2 different concepts as though they are the same. Typically, this occurs because those 2 concepts have the same word for them. So something like laws must be authored. So the laws of nature must have had an author. This is a somewhat poetic allusion to the idea of God as creator, right? And there's something to it. At least at first, it's beautiful. It's a little bit poetic. It's kind of nice. Not quite beautiful, but nice, right? But the 2 terms here, laws, right? Laws is used twice, but it's used in very different ways, right? In the first case, laws means human laws, right? Things people wrote down and passed, right? So those must be authored. Yeah, absolutely. In the second case, they're talking about systematic regularities in the behavior of the physical world. That's a very different kind of thing. Now, it may in fact be the case that those regularities do need to be explained through the presence of an author, through the presence of a creator. But if that is the case, it is not by analogy to written laws, which are incredibly different, right? That step, that leap doesn't work. Equivocation also occurs. I'm trying to think of another good example. Equivocation is one that's kind of harder to think of examples for. Equivocation also occurs a lot when we're talking about things with words with multiple values or words with ambiguous values. So things like tall. Whether or not someone's tall or not depends upon context, right? A tall miniature poodle is a short dog. And so words like this, ambiguous words, that especially those that generate their meaning from the context, are especially prone to being equivocal. Right? Especially prone to being subjected to equivocation. And so we need to be very careful that in both instances, the term used has the same meaning. So those are our fallacies. I'm sure that not all of it got through right away. So, I'll be around to email with. And of course, I'm going to be posting my notes online as well, which should be a little bit more thorough, maybe. It's a little awkward to not have the usual back and forth, but you do know you can email me if you have any questions. And I'm going to open the discussion forums this week. So we'll have a place to chat. But let's say, okay, we've got our fallacies down. we have this sort of toolbox full of ways of thinking, quick tools, sort of diagnostic tools, right? Well, is it one of these? Is it one of these? Is it one of these? These let us check down very quickly and see, well, is it a bad argument? If it's one of these, it probably is. But if we want something a little more sophisticated, we can use a tool set that I call rapid argument analysis, or you can call it TAG. I've worked very hard to get these words to fit an acronym. So tag the argument. So let's say you've got 5 minutes. You should have read it last night. You should have read it last week, but you didn't. I'm sure we can all, this sounds familiar to all of us at some point in our lives. And there are often going to be days when you need to know now what is right and what is wrong about this argument, right? You need to know very quickly the key information. There are 3 things you can look at that will give you the most beneficial sort of jump start on understanding an argument. The first is the thesis. Probably the most important feature of an argument. You need to find out what question an argument answers, this would actually be the topic, and what answer it provides to that question, the thesis. This helps you know what an argument is about. Once you have identified the thesis, you know what everything that comes after it should be contributing to. You know what to look for and how to judge the quality of the argument, because the quality of the argument is ultimately determined about whether or not it makes the thesis plausible. Next up, you want to know the audience. You want to know who the arguer is trying to address. This helps us to understand how the argument is being presented and what assumptions are being made. That is, what things is the author assuming to be true? Because presumably they're going to determine their assumptions based upon their audience. Right? They're going to say, well, if I'm arguing, in fact, let's say I'm arguing with a Catholic scholar, right? Or in a Catholic church, let's say you were having a discussion about the nature of God amongst Catholic scholars. Well, if everyone here is a Catholic scholar, then I can presumably assume Catholicism, right? I can just assume it and not have to justify it. But if I'm going to go into a synagogue and start talking, well, now I have to make a different set of assumptions. And if I'm speaking to an atheist, well, then that's a very different set of assumptions, right? So knowing who the audience of an argument is, who's supposed to be listening to it, helps us understand why the author chose to present it in a certain way, and what assumptions are being made that we, especially important, may not share, because that will influence whether or not we understand the argument appropriately. Finally, we want to know the goals of the argument. We want to know what the arguer intends the argument to do. What effect is it supposed to happen? And we want to know both what the personal motivation is, right? What is their goal for themselves making this argument? What gets them to get up and talk, right? For me, right now, it's because I'm teaching, right? That's my goal. My goal is to teach here. But we also want to know what the argument itself is supposed to do in context of the audience, right? Am I supposed to get up and march? Is that what this is for, right? Am I supposed to be motivated to political action? Am I supposed to be able to do math better, right? There's very different sorts of goals that arguments may in fact have. Once we've identified these 3, the thesis, audience, and goal, so tag, right? We've gotten a strong context for an argument in 5 minutes, maybe 10, and helps to prepare for more thorough reading. It isn't, of course, actually a replacement for reading the whole thing, but it is a good idea before you sit down to read any prolonged works, because it can be very easy to get lost in a longer work if you're trying to figure it out as you go along. But once you've tagged it, once you've found out its thesis, audience, and goal, you're at least going to be able to remain in the ballpark. You're going to be able to be relatively focused as you read through it and know what you're looking for. So this is just one set of tools that will help us understand arguments more effectively. So that's it for today's lecture. I hope that it was clear. I know I rambled a bit at parts. I'm trying to be more natural with my speaking in these, so I'm speaking more like I would were we face-to-face. It is awkward not having immediate interaction, and so I'm not getting questions from you guys. So I can't tell. Right? The camera seems to understand it fine, as does the microphone. So hopefully you do as well. As we move through the semester and we get more practice with this system, I'm sure that the videos will continue to improve. And I'm going to continue asking for feedback, and I appreciate those of you who have already given me feedback about the video lectures, and I've tried to incorporate some of your comments already. So hopefully we'll be able to keep moving forward and make better and better quality lectures. Now, next week is going to be the first time we lecture about what we might call the content proper of this class, right? We're actually going to be looking at content from one of our books. In fact, we're going to be looking at content from this book, The Very Short Introduction to Knowledge, authored by Jennifer Nagel. The first 2 chapters, as well as a short reading from Rene Descartes' First Meditations. I'm going to give, probably tomorrow, maybe Friday, I'll set up a short video that will introduce the ideas that we're going to be looking at, though it won't be the full lecture. My lecture will assume that you have read this material. Now, luckily, since it's an online lecture, there's some flexibility there. If you haven't read it by Monday or Tuesday, that's fine. Wait till Wednesday or Thursday, then watch the lecture. So I would recommend reading before you watch my lecture, because it will help you to understand the lecture better, and otherwise you're going to be just, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. What is that word? But yeah. So that'll be next week. Until then, I guess I'll see you next time, or, look awkwardly into the camera and steeple my hands a lot. I don't know. Still working on the what to do with my hands things. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture. I hope it was informative and clear, and I look forward to hearing from you.